I always thought my boss's wife was out of my league, until the night she called me, her voice trembling, asking for help. What I didn't know was that this one ride would take us into a world of secrets, temptation, and decisions that could destroy everything. As I looked into her tear-filled eyes, I realized this wasn't just a favor. It was the beginning of something I wasn't ready for. It was just another ordinary day, or so I thought. I was finishing up my shift at the office, ready to head home and unwind after a long week. Working as an assistant for a high-profile businessman like Mark wasn't easy. He was a perfectionist, sharp and intimidating, always demanding more. I had learned to keep my head down and stay professional, avoiding his temper whenever possible. Mark's wife, Sarah, however, was a completely different story. She was elegant and composed, with a warmth that stood in stark contrast to her husband's cold demeanor. I had seen her at company events, always by Mark's side, smiling and making polite conversation. She seemed like the perfect wife, gracious, supportive, and charming. But there was something about her eyes, something distant, as though she was carrying a weight no one else could see. I never expected to interact with Sarah beyond a polite hello at the office parties, but that evening changed everything. I was packing up when my phone buzzed. It was Sarah. Her voice, soft yet tinged with urgency, caught me off guard. "Jason," she said hesitantly, "I need a favor. Mark's busy, and I have a meeting across town. Can you give me a ride?" I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. I hesitated, unsure if this was crossing some unspoken boundary. She was my boss's wife, after all. But there was something in her tone, something vulnerable, that made it impossible to say no. When I arrived at her house, I was struck by how serene everything looked from the outside. Their neighborhood was pristine, and their home stood out as a picture-perfect dream. But as Sarah got into the car, her composure faltered for a brief moment. She looked at me with tired eyes and a faint smile, as though she was holding herself together just long enough to keep up appearances. As I started the engine, I couldn't shake the feeling that this ride wasn't going to be as simple as it seemed. The drive started quietly, the hum of the car's engine filling the silence between us. I wasn't sure what to say. After all, Sarah was my boss's wife, and small talk felt strangely inappropriate. But it didn't take long for her to break the silence. "Jason," she began, her voice hesitant, "do you ever feel like you're stuck in a role you didn't choose?" I glanced at her briefly, unsure how to answer. "I guess everyone feels that way sometimes," I replied, trying to keep the conversation neutral. But something about the way she said it made me realize this wasn't just idle chatter. Her gaze was fixed out the window, her fingers nervously tracing patterns on her lap. "I know Mark seems like the perfect husband on the outside," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But lately, it's like I don't exist to him. I'm just there, an accessory for his public life. He's always working, always focused on his next deal. I don't even know the last time we had a real conversation." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't what I expected when I agreed to give her a ride. Her words were raw, unguarded, and they left me unsure of how to respond. "That sounds tough," I said carefully, keeping my eyes on the road. "Have you talked to him about it?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Talk to him? Mark doesn't listen. He hears what he wants and tunes out the rest. I've tried for years to reach him, to make him see me, but nothing changes." There was a pause, and the air in the car grew heavier. Her vulnerability felt too intimate, too close. This wasn't the kind of conversation an employee should be having with his boss's wife. But at the same time, I couldn't help but feel for her. She was opening up to me in a way I doubted she ever had with anyone else. As we drove through the dimly lit streets, I began to notice little things. The way her voice caught when she spoke about her loneliness. The way she avoided mentioning Mark's name, as though saying it would summon some invisible weight she didn't want to bear. And then there was the way her eyes lingered on me when I glanced her way. Searching, questioning, almost pleading. When we arrived at her destination, she hesitated before getting out. "Thank you for listening, Jason," she said softly. I know I shouldn't be unloading all this on you, but I needed someone to hear me. It's okay, I said, though my voice felt strained. Sometimes you just need to let it out. She gave me a faint smile, but her eyes betrayed the turmoil she was trying to hide. You're kind, she said, almost to herself. More than most people I know. As she walked away, I sat in the car, replaying her words in my mind. It wasn't just her unhappiness that struck me. It was the fact that she had chosen to share it with me. Out of everyone in her life, she had picked me to confide in. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Her sadness, her vulnerability, the quiet desperation in her voice, they all clung to me like a shadow. And then there were the moments I couldn't ignore. The way her hand lingered on the car door, the way her voice softened when she said my name, the way she looked at me as though I was the only one who had truly seen her. Something had shifted between us. It was subtle, unspoken, but undeniable. And as much as I tried to push it out of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Days turned into weeks, but I couldn't get Sarah out of my mind. Her words, her vulnerability, and the way she looked at me lingered like an unshakable shadow. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be her. And when it finally was, my heart raced in a way that felt both thrilling and dangerous. Jason, her message read, are you free to meet? I need to talk. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. This was wrong. Every instinct told me to keep my distance. But something deeper, something I couldn't fully control, urged me to reply. Of course. Where should I meet you? We decided on a quiet coffee shop far from the office and any prying eyes. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting by the window. The soft sunlight framed her face, highlighting the tension in her expression. She looked up as I approached, and for a moment the weight of her gaze made my breath catch. Thanks for coming, she said softly, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup. I didn't know who else to turn to. I nodded, sitting across from her. I'm here. What's on your mind? She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. It's Mark, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought things might get better, but they've only gotten worse. He's colder than ever, and I feel like I'm fading into the background of his life. I didn't know what to say, so I let her continue. I've tried to fix things, Jason. I really have. But I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. I'm so tired of being invisible. Her voice broke, and before I realized what I was doing, I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. You're not invisible, I said firmly, my eyes locking with hers. Not to me. The moment stretched, and neither of us moved. Her fingers trembled slightly beneath mine, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at me with a vulnerability that was both heartbreaking and magnetic. Jason, she whispered, her voice trailing off as though she was searching for the right words. But before she could say anything more, the waiter interrupted, setting down a fresh cup of coffee. The spell was broken, and we quickly withdrew our hands, both of us suddenly hyper-aware of the boundary we had just crossed. The rest of the conversation was cautious, filled with half-truths and unspoken emotions. But when it was time to leave, she hesitated, standing outside the cafe as though she wasn't ready to say goodbye. Walk with me? She asked, her voice soft but hopeful. I nodded, falling into step beside her. The streets were quiet, the setting sun casting a warm glow over everything. We walked in silence for a while, the space between us charged with tension. And then, as we rounded a corner into a secluded park, she stopped abruptly. Jason, she said, turning to face me. Her eyes were wide, searching mine for answers I didn't have. I don't know what's happening between us, but I can't ignore it anymore. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. Neither can I admitted, my voice barely audible. But this isn't right, Sarah. You're married. Her eyes filled with tears and she shook her head. I know. Believe me, I know. But when I'm with you, I feel alive. Like someone finally sees me for who I am, not just who I'm supposed to be. Her words hit me like a tidal wave, and before I could stop myself, I reached out, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. It was just the two of us, standing on the edge of a decision that could change everything. I don't want to hurt you, I said softly, my hand lingering near her face. Or him. But Sarah, this is dangerous. I know, she whispered, stepping closer. But it feels so real, Jason. More real than anything I've felt in years. The distance between us disappeared, and for a brief, electric moment, we were suspended in a place where consequences didn't exist. My heart pounded as I struggled to hold back, but her gaze, her presence, her very existence pulled me in like gravity. And then it happened. A tentative, hesitant kiss that carried the weight of every unspoken word and every suppressed feeling. It was fleeting, a mere brush of lips, but it was enough to set my world spinning. When we finally pulled apart, reality came crashing back, and the guilt hit me like a freight train. Sarah, I began, but she silenced me with a finger to my lips. I know, she said, her voice trembling. I know this is wrong. But for just one moment, I needed to feel something. We stood there in the fading light, the world around us utterly still. I knew we couldn't stay like this, but neither of us was ready to let go. Not yet. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't quite process. Every interaction with Sarah played on a loop in my mind. The way she looked at me, the vulnerability in her voice, and that kiss. It was a line we couldn't uncross, and yet I couldn't bring myself to regret it. I tried to maintain my distance, to focus on work and keep things professional. But fate had other plans. One evening, while I was finishing up at the office, my phone buzzed. It was Sarah again. This time, her message was shorter, more urgent. Can you come over? It's important. A knot of anxiety tightened in my chest. I knew I should say no, that nothing good could come from seeing her again. But my fingers betrayed me, typing a quick reply. On my way. When I arrived at her house, the lights inside were dim, and the air outside felt heavier than usual. Sarah opened the door before I could knock, her expression a mix of relief and tension. Come in, she said softly, stepping aside to let me in. Her living room, usually pristine, was cluttered with papers and an empty wine glass on the coffee table. She motioned for me to sit, but I remained standing, sensing that whatever she had to say wasn't going to be easy. Jason, she began, her voice trembling. Mark found out. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Found out? I repeated, my heart racing. Found out what, Sarah? About us, she said, her gaze dropping to the floor. About the kiss. He saw the messages. I felt the blood drain from my face. Messages? What messages? She hesitated, wringing her hands. I couldn't stop thinking about you, Jason. I sent you those texts, and somehow he saw them. I don't know how, but he knows. Panic surged through me. My career, my reputation. It was all on the line now. What did he say? I asked, my voice barely steady. He's furious, she admitted, her eyes filling with tears. He didn't say much, but the way he looked at me. I've never seen him like that before. I think he's planning something, Jason. I don't know what, but I'm scared. Before I could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made both of us freeze. Sarah's eyes widened in fear. It's him, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You have to go. Now. But before I could move, the front door swung open, and there he was. Mark. His presence filled the room like a storm, his eyes dark and unreadable. He looked at Sarah first, then at me, his gaze sharp enough to cut through steel. Jason, he said, his voice calm but laced with venom. What a surprise. I didn't realize you'd become so close to my wife. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Mark stepped further into the room, his posture tense but controlled. You've always been a good employee, he continued, his tone deceptively smooth. Loyal, dependable. So imagine my disappointment when I find out you've been undermining me. Mark, please, Sarah interjected, her voice desperate. It's not what you think. He turned to her, his expression cold. Isn't it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife has been seeking comfort from someone who should know better. My chest tightened as the weight of his words settled over me. It was a mistake, I managed to say, my voice trembling. It won't happen again. Mark let out a bitter laugh. A mistake? That's an interesting choice of words, Jason. Tell me, was it a mistake when you let her pour her heart out to you? When you decided to cross the line between professionalism and whatever this is? Stop it, Sarah cried, stepping between us. This isn't his fault, Mark. If you'd been paying attention to me, to us, none of this would have happened. Her words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Mark's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But instead, he turned to me, his gaze steady and unrelenting. You're fired, he said coldly. Effective immediately. And if I ever see you near my wife again, I'll make sure you regret it. My heart sank, but I couldn't argue. I had crossed a line, and now I was paying the price. Without another word, I turned and walked out the door, the weight of everything I'd lost pressing down on me. The days that followed were a blur of shame and regret. I avoided Sarah's calls, knowing that any contact with her would only make things worse. But one evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, my phone buzzed with a message that made my chest tighten. Jason, I need to see you. Please. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. When she arrived, she looked different. Tired, fragile, but determined. I left him, she said without preamble, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I couldn't stay in that house, pretending everything was okay. Not after everything. I stared at her stunned. Sarah, I know, she interrupted, her eyes searching mine. I know this is complicated, and I don't expect anything from you. But I couldn't stay there, Jason. I deserve more than a life of loneliness. Her words hit me like a tidal wave, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. But as I looked at her, standing there with her heart on her sleeve, I realized something. I cared about her. Despite everything, despite the chaos and the consequences, I couldn't deny what I felt. I don't know where this is going, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But I'm here, Sarah, for whatever comes next. She smiled faintly, a flicker of hope lighting up her tired features. And as she stepped closer, the weight of the past began to lift, leaving only the fragile possibility of what might come next. In the weeks that followed, everything around me felt like it was unraveling. Losing my job was just the beginning. My professional reputation was tarnished, and whispers about the incident spread through my industry faster than I could contain them. But what weighed on me more than anything else was the guilt. Guilt over crossing a line, over letting things spiral out of control, and most of all, over hurting people who didn't deserve it. Sarah had moved into a small apartment downtown. It was modest, a far cry from the lavish home she had shared with Mark. But in her words, it was freedom. I visited her a few times, each meeting tinged with a strange mix of hope and regret. We tried to pretend things were normal, but there was an unspoken tension between us, an awareness of how fragile this connection was. One evening, as we sat in her sparsely furnished living room, she finally broke the silence. Do you think we made a mistake? She asked, her voice quiet but steady. I looked at her, unsure how to answer. I don't know, I admitted. I've thought about it every day since it happened. And honestly, I don't know if it was a mistake or just Inevitable. She nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. Mark was furious when I left, she said after a pause. He said I was throwing everything away for nothing, that I'd regret it. Do you? I asked, my chest tightening at the thought. She hesitated, her expression conflicted. I don't regret leaving him, she said finally. But I'm not sure where we're going. Her words stung, though I couldn't blame her for feeling uncertain. We had started something reckless, something neither of us had planned for. And now, we were left to pick up the pieces. Meanwhile, Mark wasn't letting go without a fight. I started receiving anonymous threats, emails and texts warning me to stay away from Sarah. At first, I thought they were just empty words, but then I noticed someone following me. A black SUV parked near my apartment, its driver always watching but never approaching. I confronted Sarah about it one evening. Do you think Mark's behind this? I asked, my voice low but urgent. She sighed, her face pale. It wouldn't surprise me, she said. He's not the kind of man who lets go easily. The realization sent a chill down my spine. Mark wasn't just angry, he was out for revenge. And the thought of what he might do next kept me up at night. The tension reached a boiling point when Mark confronted Sarah directly. He showed up at her apartment unannounced, his presence as commanding as ever. I wasn't there, but Sarah told me about it afterward, her voice shaking as she recounted the encounter. He said I humiliated him, she said, her hands trembling as she held her coffee cup. That I made him look weak in front of his colleagues. He demanded I come back, said he'd forgive me if I ended things with you. What did you say? I asked, my stomach knotting. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with tears. I told him no. I told him I'm not going back to a life where I'm invisible. Her words should have reassured me, but instead, they filled me with dread. Mark wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat. I could see it in the way Sarah's hands shook, in the way her voice faltered when she spoke about him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As days turned into weeks, the weight of our choices became harder to ignore. Sarah and I found solace in each other, but it came at a cost. The guilt of what we had done lingered like a shadow, coloring every moment we spent together. And though we tried to move forward, the scars of the past refused to fade. One night, as we sat on her balcony overlooking the city, Sarah spoke words that had been haunting both of us. Do you think we'll ever be happy? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to answer. I think happiness is complicated, I said finally. But I do know one thing. We can't build a future if we're constantly looking over our shoulders. She nodded, but the sadness in her eyes told me she wasn't convinced. And neither was I. Our relationship had been born out of chaos, and now we were trying to find stability in the wreckage. But stability felt like a distant dream. The fallout didn't just affect us, it rippled through everyone around us. Mark's anger turned into bitterness, and though he never directly confronted me again, I knew he was working behind the scenes to make my life difficult. Opportunities I thought were secure vanished without explanation, and colleagues who once respected me now avoided me altogether. Sarah faced her own challenges. Friends she thought she could rely on turned their backs on her, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire of her messy separation. She put on a brave face, but I could see the toll it was taking on her. We're like fugitives, she said one evening, her tone half joking but laced with bitterness. Running from a life we couldn't stand, only to find ourselves trapped in another. Her words stayed with me, a stark reminder of how far we had fallen. But even in the darkness there were moments of light, moments where her laughter broke through the gloom, where her smile reminded me why I had taken this risk in the first place. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Sarah had become more than just a forbidden temptation. She was someone I cared about deeply, someone I wanted to see happy, even if it meant sacrificing my own comfort. But as the days stretched into months, I couldn't help but wonder if we were chasing an impossible dream. Months had passed, and the chaos that had once consumed our lives began to settle into something resembling normalcy. But normal didn't feel the same anymore. Sarah and I had built something fragile, something that teetered between hope and uncertainty. The weight of the past lingered, but we were determined to move forward, even if we didn't know what that meant. Sarah had started a new job at a nonprofit organization. It wasn't as glamorous as the life she'd left behind, but it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She spoke about her work with a passion I'd never seen before, and it was clear she was beginning to rediscover herself. Watching her transform was bittersweet. On one hand, I was proud of her strength, but on the other, I couldn't help but wonder if I had been more of a burden than a help. One evening, as we sat together on her balcony, she broke the silence. "Jason," she said, her voice steady but soft, "I think I've finally figured out what I want." I looked at her, bracing myself for what she was about to say. "And what's that?" She smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the city lights below. "I want to stop living in the shadow of what I've lost. I want to start building something real, something honest. But to do that, I need to let go of the past." Her words hit me harder than I expected. "Are you saying you want to let go of us?" She turned to me, her expression filled with a mix of sorrow and resolve. "I don't know," she admitted. "I care about you, Jason, more than I ever thought I could. But I don't want to keep holding on to something that started the wrong way. If we're going to have a chance, it has to be for the right reasons." I nodded, understanding the truth in her words. "You're right," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "We can't build something real if we're still carrying the weight of everything that's happened." For the first time in months, we sat in silence, not as two people running from their pasts, but as two individuals trying to figure out their futures. And in that moment, I realized that loving someone sometimes meant letting them go. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and I began to drift apart. It wasn't a sudden break, but a gradual mutual understanding that we needed time to heal on our own. She threw herself into her work, finding fulfillment in helping others. I began to focus on rebuilding my career, taking small steps toward regaining the confidence I'd lost. Every now and then, we'd exchange messages, a simple, "How are you?" or a brief update about our lives. But the intensity that had once defined our relationship was gone, replaced by something quieter and more restrained. One day, as I sat in a coffee shop revising my resume, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The choices I'd made, the lines I'd crossed, the pain I'd caused. It all felt like a blur now, a series of moments that had reshaped me in ways I hadn't expected. I realized something important that day. Life doesn't offer clean endings or easy resolutions. Mistakes are messy, and the consequences linger long after the moment has passed. But those mistakes don't have to define us. What matters is how we choose to move forward, what lessons we take with us as we try to become better versions of ourselves. For Sarah and me, the story wasn't about a fairy tale romance or a perfect ending. It was about growth, about learning what we truly wanted and needed from life. She had found her independence, her sense of self, and I had learned the hard way that love, real love, can't be built on a foundation of secrecy and betrayal. As I left the coffee shop that day, I felt a strange sense of peace. Sarah and I may not have ended up together, but in a way, we had saved each other. She had shown me what it meant to truly see someone, to care for them even when it was messy and complicated. And I had reminded her that she was more than just someone's wife. She was her own person, capable of rebuilding her life on her terms. If you were in Sarah or Jason's position, what would you have done differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Life is full of messy choices, and sometimes, the hardest decisions teach us the most. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories that challenge your views, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. See you in the next one.